Hello and welcome to the Predictable B2B Success podcast brought to you by Sproutwith.com. I'm Vinay Koshy and our guest today is Katie McLaughlin. Katie, you are the founder and chief strategist and transformation artist at McLaughlin Method. I believe you help organizations create engaged employees and positive, inclusive workplace culture. You use improv theater techniques to help create these outcomes, which I'm curious about and look forward to diving into. But you really bring 20 years of experience with facilitating coaching, teaching in various organizations. You've actually earned 2 Horizon Awards for your training and supported software implementation, along with change management programs, onboarding programs for sales, customer service, and other customer-facing roles. So you've obviously got a wealth of experience. I believe you decided to venture out into the entrepreneurship space care of the pandemic. But I'm curious, why bring improv theater to this whole change management space?
First of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited that we're chatting today. And I have a theater background. So I went to my undergraduate, college, university years and received a degree in theater. And for me, it was so transformational, understanding myself better, but then also seeing this kind of ripple effect of how being involved in producing theater and being an actor or an improviser, there's just so many lessons that can be used towards business. And probably, I don't know, a decade ago, maybe, I had this moment where I realized I was stepping into a coaching session with a challenging individual. And I thought to myself, oh, how much do I have to prepare for this? What do I need to do? And first of all, I reminded myself that I am a trained improviser. And so I know how to improvise in the moment. But then I also remembered one of the lessons that I learned as a directing student, that the best directors bring things out of people rather than feeding them what we call a line reading in theater, where we essentially tell them exactly how to do it. And when we do that in business or in the theater, we're not going to get anything genuine or self-motivated. And as a result, we're also not going to get anything. And that's where kind of some of my origins of realizing these valuable tools that I had learned in my theater training could be exceptionally useful for people in the business world.
I'm curious, with this idea of bringing out the best in people, you really suggesting that we should look at each employee or as an individual and seek to bring out the best in them, which speaks to not just culture, but also recruitment as well, in order to find the right fit, but ensure that when they're part of your company, you're essentially investing in their personal growth. Is that the kind of mindset that you're suggesting we bring?
Most definitely. We could see people as numbers, and especially if you are working for a very large organization that has thousands of employees, at some point, you are so far distanced from the day-to-day experience that you forget that there's individual humans who have special talents, special perspectives that could bring so much more to your teams and to your company. And so, what I advocate for is, first and foremost, I work primarily with teams and with leaders who are managing direct contributors, because they're going to be the ones that have the most profound impact on the day-to-day experience and can really help to personalize the experience for individuals. But all of that intel and information needs to be funneled back up, because it's the department heads and the C-suite who are making decisions about what are our performance targets and what does that mean. For example, if we stay in that facing position that you mentioned in my bio, that we expect sales reps to make X number of calls, for example, as like a leading indicator for their success. But if there might be a disconnect around someone's ability to connect with folks, and maybe they don't need to do the X number of calls a day or 500 calls a week or whatever that is, because they have figured out a way to zero in on the best prospects and increase their close rate without needing to, spray, what I've heard people say, spray and pray in the sales world. There really is a very lovely overlap between ensuring people have a personalized and considerate experience based on their needs, as well as meeting business goals. They don't have to be in conflict with each other.
Okay, brilliant. I'd love to explore that a little bit more. But Katie, I'm also curious, at a personal level, what would you say is your personal area of strength?
Recently, I've learned two big things that I can contribute to the workplace, my clients. First and foremost, I have a huge bias for action. And so I'm always about, we shouldn't just be talking about things in theory, right? We need to know, cool, how do I take that and do something with it? Because we can read all the leadership books in the world, we can listen to all the podcasts and get little nuggets, but how do we implement that?
Yeah.
And so I am an expert at giving people like tiny actions that they could create to build habits that would then the structure that they might need.
Okay.
And then my second kind of big, what I call my superpower, is ideation. So I actually tap into an improv skill to do this called explore and heighten, where essentially you don't ever have to find a ceiling. You just keep adding on ideas and keep playing with the idea of whatever that problem is or the issue that someone might be experiencing in the workplace.
And in that area of strength, what would you say is something that businesses don't know? But
I think the biggest thing that jumps out at me from that is that within that kind of bias for action space, we can assume that we are all going into a business project or conversation with that bias for action, or kind of with a purpose or with a goal or an objective. But so frequently I see in business people doing things just because they think they're supposed to. And when we're not connected back to the why we are taking this action or to what end, then that action becomes pointless, or it just becomes this rote action that has really very little meaning.
As you're looking to help companies take action, better their culture, what would you say from your observations are the problems that you're noticing with the current and perhaps more popularly prescribed employee engagement initiatives?
Most of it falls into this like checklist or kind of checkbox activities. And if you even just do a quick internet search of top 10 employee engagement activities, you'll get the list. And a lot of it still skews to all of us working in person. What kind of events are we holding? And do you have like happy hours? And do you have free food or free swag or what have you? And when in reality, our experience as employees being engaged, and what does engaged really mean? It means that you actually you care about the work you're doing in such a way that you want to do it to a high standard. You're not trying to subvert a system or work an angle. All of that is good for business, right? Because we're getting quality and integrity in the workplace. And we do that when we feel cared about, when we feel like we're part of a group, so included, if we use the inclusion word out there, right? And then we also feel that way if we have opportunity, right? So if somebody does see us, like you were describing before, as someone to be invested in, and that it's not just lip service, those are some of the things that can help with engagement. And then we can go, it's even more important, I think, to go levels deeper to how do we talk to each other in the workplace? And how does a leader ask for a status on something? Is it only ever via a kind of online instant message chat, whichever one you happen to use? And is it just a random out of a blue message of, hey, where's that thing I asked for? To you, that might sound, oh, this is just purely a curiosity, a question. Or rather, your employee, if they're feeling stressed out, if they're already having doubts about where they sit in your mind, more than likely, they're going to skew that tone, which is absent from your text. They're going to skew the tone to the negative. No, I have to give a false answer, maybe make myself look good. And that just continues to breed tension and stress for your employees. Nobody wants to live in that space of tension and stress. And that's what causes people to be disengaged and then leave.
Let me see if I can unpack that a little bit. From what I'm hearing, you're almost suggesting that we think about the way a brand as an organization should impact people, because perhaps there's not a lot of thought being put into that. People often think about customer service and how customers respond to the sales process or to the service process, etc. But from there, you almost need to work backwards and think your customer-facing people are supposed to be operating in a particular mode or with a particular type of personality. How does our internal communication and the way we behave towards each other impact those very folk, and so on and so forth? I'm seeing you nodding, so I'm assuming I'm on the right track here.
Absolutely. Yeah. Most companies have mission and vision and values. And one of the questions, or a group of questions on your typical employee engagement survey, which could also be a culture survey, is how effective is the leadership team at conveying those mission and vision and values? Yeah. And it's not just enough to say, hey, here's our values and here's why. We have to help it be a lived experience at work. When a value, I see a ton of companies using a value similar to transparency. And if that's going to be a value, is that felt by your employees? Or do they feel like decisions are being made behind closed doors without the input from people who are going to have to experience those changes or decisions or carry them out? That's an immediate way that people could feel, oh, this value is just something we talk about and use to make people outside our company think we're awesome.
With this idea, you talked about culture. Would you suggest, as I've heard of some others suggest, that we actually formalize this into some sort of deck or document that is not just available to people, but is brought up in pretty much every meeting? I'm assuming it cannot be like a 10-page or even a 500-page document that you need to pour over every time, but at least the core elements of it should be looked over.
Yeah. So as I was developing, I actually have mentioned I work predominantly with managers. I also have a program for working with an executive team, because in order to have the best ripple effect on change, you have to start from the top. And the biggest thing that comes out of that is what I call a culture contribution plan. So that's very action focused and talks about the different actions we would take to contribute to our culture. And it all ties back to the values. So that might include a list of different things that might happen in a brainstorming conversation. Mm-hmm. That's where my mind went to when you said deck. It was that in like a brainstorming conversation, we might be setting kind of a rules of engagement, or here's how this is going to go. Mm-hmm. Why not have that include things that integrate your values? If we value transparency, then we want people to be sharing their ideas, and that can include criticism. Right. So there might be a slide with here's some bullet points of here's how our values can be felt in this conversation and the way we want to angle or push or lead our trajectory for this conversation.
I was just thinking that this is very much in line with something I like to highlight during these podcast episodes, which is the fact that we are dealing with people, and people, if we want to deal with each other, then we should invest in relationships, which is primarily driven by experiences and being remark-worthy experiences. So listeners are probably going, this sounds very interesting, but you know what? I would have a hard time measuring the outcome of these sorts of things. It's one thing to listen to notes that are mentioned or comments that are overheard, but how do we get a quicker loop happening where we know that we're on track and we can actually measure perhaps some of the ROI if we had to go down this?
So everything that we do in business ties back to a business metric. And as you described, business is about people, right? So it's people who facilitate you meeting your business goals, things like productivity, revenue goals, overall kind of employee per company performance. If you're a software company, your churn rate for your customers, all of that. And people are the ones who help influence that. And so when you start to take stock of, okay, where are we at right now? Run all of those key metrics. And then from each metric, you can go down another level to see, Are there patterns or influences across particular departments or even across particular teams? So if there is, say you have 10 sales teams and one of those sales teams or half of those sales teams are very far behind the others, that's where you can start to ask some questions and think, okay, where should we start to put some effort, some kind of resourcing to support that productivity? Because that productivity need is likely a people need, right? And so that's one way that you can start to point yourself towards where should we take action? And then once you start taking action, then at set intervals, you could be rerunning those same metrics for those populations and see what kind of impact has been made. So that's something that any business leader could do, even any manager, right? You could run similar metrics for your own team and make changes and then look at them again.
Okay.
The other piece I think that most leaders aren't aware can support them is the employee engagement survey, like I mentioned before. Most companies are doing them these days, whether they are super formal. There's tons of software providers out there who provide them and help you get really lovely ways to slice and dice and look at the data. But that's really the best way that you can get anonymous feedback about people's, what I call lived and felt experience. Most of these surveys are structured in such a way that employees are rating the strength of their opinion that a statement is true. And many of those statements are feeling statements. I feel supported by my leader, right? My executive effectively conveys our mission and vision. They're very impression based, and it's those impressions that help you realize where you need to take action. So if that example of I feel supported by my leader, if 60% of your team says agree or strongly agree, great. But then don't stop there, because 40% of your whole company feels they are not supported by their leader.
Yeah.
And so that's where you can start to drill down. Are there departments that are having more challenges? Are there business lines that are having more challenges? And that's where you start to get your roadmap of where to make changes, where to invest time, resources. And so these are data points you already have. If you're not doing an employee engagement survey, I highly recommend you start doing one, because they are so invaluable. But most companies have all of this data at their fingertips. You don't have to run anything special.
I was just thinking that I would agree that having that information from those engagement surveys can be quite useful. The problem I tend to have with it, though, is it's a bit of a lagging indicator. And sometimes you have to, by the time you get the data, problems could have become a lot worse than if you had been able to nip it in the bud, so to speak, earlier on. Also, I have a question around motivation. Because quite often I see people put in roles or moved into roles, perhaps because of their performance, perhaps because there is a dire need, but it doesn't necessarily match with their motivations. And I'm curious as to how you, if at all, are able to unearth some of those motivations and then think about an appropriate match for their motivations, their skills and potential positions in order to ensure an equitable outcome for the organization as a whole, as well as each individual.
Unfortunately, every role is not going to be 100% matched to probably any individual. We all have things we have to do at work that we don't like. And often it's just tweaking the percentage of those things that we don't like versus the things that we do. And what I have found, recently I was just talking to a client who was really struggling at work because they were being asked to do a bunch of things that they didn't want to do. And so I did ask them, do you know what work is exciting to you? And I don't think we ask that question as leaders often enough. We assume that we know, and we all know that assumptions are a terrible idea. So why not ask more of your employees? Ask them what they want to be working on. And then by looking at your whole team, maybe not even just an individual, but when you look at your whole team, you can start to see where you can kind of take almost these people as puzzle pieces, and maybe even your roles as puzzle pieces. And maybe a certain role or a task grouping gets split among 2 people, and then this other task grouping gets split among 3 people, or you do some restructuring, maybe not on a role basis, but on a project basis, on a responsibility basis. There's all kinds of changes that we could make that could help like raise the bar a little bit for folks. And now maybe that sounds like a lot of hard work, because it is. At the end of the day, we all have reasons why we go to work. And maybe that's because we love the work. Maybe that's because we're really passionate about the company and the impact of that company. Maybe it's because we love the people we work with. Or maybe it's because we just need to provide for our family. And this happens to be a thing that we're good at. And sometimes we need to be reminded of how our work can fit and connect with and benefit any of those things. The more successful your business is, the more likely it is that you can offer better pay, better benefits, that you can hire more people so people aren't as stressed or taking on too much. So that helps the individual who's, I just have to be here to support my, we have to be making those connections because it's hard for us to see them when we're just like, I hate everything about my job.
Certainly. Yeah. Okay. I'm curious. How would you use the techniques that you've developed to address some of these pain points? Because from an executive level, you might notice things like a sales slump or a decrease in productivity, but how do you actually ensure that you're addressing the key problem, not just the symptom, and bring it down to an individual level?
So the theater techniques that I primarily use are a body of work called image theater. We use our bodies, our facial expressions to create an image of a situation, a scenario, but often how we really feel about something, or even a blocker, what's getting in our way of completing this. And so this could be done with a team, with kind of a cohort of leaders, or even with a focus group. Say that the example you just gave of whole sales organization is underperforming. So maybe there's this lovely focus group that comes in and with the mindset that we're going to try to uncover what's keeping us from being productive. And so some example prompts that I might use would be something like create an image of something that is getting in the way of you meeting your sales goals. Okay. And so an example of that might be like some kind of image like this, where maybe I've got my hands up in front of my face, I'm scrunching my face down and making a scowly kind of face. That image is probably going to evoke different words to describe that. So I'm curious, Vinay, are there any words that came to mind when you saw that image?
Fearful.
Yeah. So that might be whether it's fearful or hesitant or unsure, that is going to get in the way of a salesperson being productive. And so now that we have that, what I would call an objective example, now we can start to unpack that as a group and say, what do you think would help you to be less hesitant? And most people know what they need in order to feel good. Maybe that's decreased pressure, right? Maybe their leader keeps yelling at them, which nobody's motivated by being yelled at. So it really just, most of this work starts to generate conversation that can help us take ourselves out of the place of feeling like we're put in a space where we have to explain something that is hard to explain. I would imagine that the average employee doesn't want to tell their boss that they're saying that, feels very vulnerable. But if we're all doing these exercises together and everybody at the same time is creating an image to that same prompt, we're going to start to see maybe there's 2 or 3 groupings of similar challenges. And then we're like, okay, we've got 2 or 3 challenges we have to break down and navigate and deal with as a.
So you're looking at the images that people are sharing with you. How does it work? Do you combine the collective images to then focus on perhaps 1 or 2 aspects, or do you ask for more feedback from the audience? How does this work? What is the level of interactivity where I'm trying to go with this?
Yeah, and it really depends on the theme of the workshop.
Right.
But if we're really trying to troubleshoot a scenario like we were just working through, we may do additional prompts if we're not all getting to the same page, or if it feels like one of the things that I do, because it's a highly tailored, highly interactive session where, if I'm starting to see that after that kind of initial prompt, where we then move into some discussion about kind of fear or what might support them, if I'm starting to sense that people are not being as honest or as open as they were maybe at the beginning, I'll have us bring in another prompt, whether that's even just being silly or being fun for a few moments, because sometimes we just need to shake out physically some of the emotion that we're experiencing, because it just gets stuck and we just start carrying it with us from conversation. It's highly interactive. People are usually creating a number of different images throughout. And I often don't just say, where are we at now? Or what's the challenge? But I say, what's the ideal? Where do you want to be? What does that look like? What does that feel like? And especially if we're talking about maybe some of these relationships that would be really challenging. If I gave that example of a sales leader yells at you. So let's create an image of both people, right? So what's the example of what the leader looks like? What's the example of what you as an individual look like? And then, okay, let's switch that and say, okay, let's take each other's place. How does that feel? So we're building empathy by taking on somebody else's image and even just recognizing the image. And then we'll look at that ideal. So what do we feel like guidance or instruction from a leader should look like? And then what would be that impact on you as an employee? How would that kind of be felt?
Assuming that before this, there would be some sort of preamble wherein you are trying to build understanding, but also a degree of confidence in getting people to feel trusted and safe, if that's the best word, in order to express themselves freely. On the flip side of it, though, if people are sharing, and perhaps I know I've certainly experienced this, people are sharing, they're contributing great ideas and thoughts. What's the onus on leadership to actually implement quickly, and more importantly, let their teams know that they've been heard, and keeping those lines of communication open?
So the best ways that these workshops go, and honestly, any kind of intervention like a focus group or even a survey, is that it is in partnership with whoever's facilitating that. When I work with my clients, I make sure that the leader knows that I want them to introduce why we're doing this. I want them to be the kind of last word and recap what has been asked for. And especially if it's a scenario like we've been describing, where change for sure is going to need to be made on an organizational level, then it's best to provide an initial estimation of how long things might take to implement, or precisely when a plan of action could be returned to that group. I would highly recommend that it be no longer than 30 days, because our world moves fast. And if people don't start seeing results and they've been really struggling, there's no reason why they wouldn't go find a new job. And that costs your company a ton of money, right? So we have to really take quick action to make good on the requests that our teams make.
You talked about how people would feel appreciated, please appreciate being communicated to, and allowing for freer communication from themselves as well. Let's take a scenario where perhaps two departments have had difficulties with each other in the past, and there have been problems, which more often than not tend to be communication problems. How would you, having unpacked that issue, then encourage them to better communicate with each other and find ways to ensure that both parties are feeling respected and better still appreciated, if at all?
Yeah, coming up with just some ideas based off of that scenario. Obviously, the people who are involved should be the ones that articulate what they need from the other people, right? For example, department number one might say, we need the requests to come in writing, so we have time to process them, and then we have a chance to come to a meeting afterwards to discuss it, right? And department two might say, that sounds good, we can do that. However, we need that meeting to be a coming together to finalize the decision, rather than us sending you our request and you all making a decision on your end and then just coming back to us. That might be some kind of rules of engagement that would be helpful for those two teams to feel communicated with and felt heard. And you've probably also noticed they're all very action-based, right? Here's the action that you can take that will help me feel heard and help meet my needs.
That certainly gives us plenty of food for thought. Katie, you're obviously very excited with the methods that you're using, the impact that it's having. Could you paint for us perhaps a few scenarios of what you've seen happen to organizations that have used these methods in order to help us better wrap our minds around what you've been sharing with us so far?
Definitely. So some of my work is in a group and some of it is also one-on-one. And with some of these one-on-one conversations that I've had with executive team members, we've been able to define systemic problems in their culture around, for example, performance reviews. So I know many companies, as we hit the end of a calendar year, that also represents the end of an annual review time period. And this company was realizing that their performance reviews and how closely they were tied to conversations about compensation and leveling meant that the performance review conversation always had a really intense tension to it, that conflict was really common as a result of performance reviews. And it really just created this kind of bad vibe throughout their teams and their organization. And that was from a single session working with a leader who was navigating one challenging conversation with an employee. But we realized there's all this systemic change that could happen to make everyone's experience better. And an example that comes to mind for me from a group scenario was a team that was really disjointed. They didn't really appreciate each other. They didn't understand how each other worked or the value of the work that they were doing. And so there were some challenging kind of power dynamics being put in place based off some of the folks who were more entry level and the folks who were more senior on that same team. And in that workshop with them, we had everybody create an image of a typical day-to-day task that they do, and then to put on that how they really feel about that work that they have to do. And then everybody went around and we each took on the images of every other person in that team. And so we got a chance to actually feel, how does it feel to be doing this activity kind of day in and day out, whether that's a good feeling or a negative feeling. And as a result, 80% of the attendees said that they felt more empathy for their team. And afterwards, they were all able to come to work with new eyes, feel like they could reach out to somebody or ask a question because they knew who that person was better and they knew what kind of challenges they're going through.
I like that word empathy that you used. It certainly goes a long way towards creating an inclusive workplace culture. Would you say that we also need to encourage?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think at the root of anything human is around compassion. One of the things I feel like I also gained from my theater experience, and maybe I already had some of that in me, but my theater experience gave me some tools to think about that. But that is this notion of perspective. Like, we don't know what's going on in that other person when, someone yells at us at work, or we're in the grocery store and someone behind us is being really adamant around how quickly you're taking. We're very quick to label something as like negative. Oh, that person's just super negative. Why can't they have a little patience? But we don't actually know what's going on for them. And maybe something really challenging and difficult and horrible happened for them. And it's just coming out in a different way. And that's compassion. That's understanding that someone is not just the product of this moment of their interaction or emotions or even performance, that we're whole people and have way more going on than just right now.
Would you also say that in order to create that degree of compassion, that as leaders, looking at employee engagement is one thing, but perhaps also having an understanding of how transparent we are, especially if we want to create a open communication type culture, an inclusive workplace culture, that transparency and how others view our degree of transparency is also important.
Yeah, how others view us is often more important than how we're framing something. We might come into a conversation with kind of the best of intentions, but who knows if it's actually going to have the impact that we expect, right? And so that's why using some of these different methods for gaining feedback can be really effective in knowing, am I having the impact I'm intending to have, or am I just assuming that I am because I said this thing to people? So yeah, I think it's really important that we are being transparent also about the actions we're trying to take to be better.
Again, in terms of being able to measure it or be able to wrap our minds around it, are employee engagement surveys a good indication of that? Or should we be asking different questions or looking at different ways to unearth that kind of information?
I agree with you that often employee engagement surveys are too much of a lagging indicator. This could have gone completely awry somewhere else. That said, there's still something. Most of these types of changes that are going to need to be made on a cultural, systemic level aren't going to be fast. And so they will need to be changed over a period of time and continue to be reinforced and ingrained in the way you all work together. So I still believe that survey can be a really helpful measurement. However, I'll also add that there's nothing that says you can't do an engagement survey more frequently. There are more and more engagement survey providers are offering different ways to survey your team. You might have heard a phrase called a pulse survey. There are some products out there who survey your employees on whatever frequency you want. So that could be even a 2-question survey every week, or a monthly, slightly longer survey, right? And maybe a quarterly employee engagement survey. But that way you're getting the feel of things throughout, and you're not waiting a full year or a full cycle to get data back.
Food for thought. I'd love to listen to all of this and process it a bit more. Katie, this has been quite enlightening. But just thinking about employee engagement, would you say that there are certain aspects that are perhaps not given much airtime or talked about because it's a little bit too hard? And if so, what would they be?
Clearly, most companies are still navigating being remote or trying to figure out this whole hybrid thing. And so, to be blunt, engagement's gotten harder. By us, more of us being home, or I assume home, by us not being at the office, right? Our home lives are more important, right? They are more in our face. They're around us all the time. And so that motivation, that engagement at work, doing things we don't want to do, it's harder to sustain now that we're remote. And so I believe that's where we need to be even more engaged ourselves, like as leaders with our teams. We should be spending way more time with our teams, with our team members, and not just in the online community chats that you have, speaking with them and trying to find out how they're actually doing. Because now we can't see it every day, right? We are going to potentially rely more on metrics about performance that might be biased by themselves. They're not going to be indicative of why is that person struggling, or why is this whole team struggling. We have to be coming up with new ideas and rethinking what our day-to-day looks like as leaders, as executives, and what things we're talking about as problems, because they're going to be very different now than they were.
To wrap things up, if you were listening to this episode, what would you say would be your top takeaway?
I think that this idea of compassion, how can I, or how can any of us maybe take a pause when we think about reacting to something that didn't go right in one of our relationships, and think about that other person first. What else could be going on for them? And can we open up a little bit emotionally to them and make it a safe place for them to share what's going on? Also, just approaching it from that perspective of, when I think about compassion, I also often couple that with gratitude or love. Those are some good other emotions to think about when considering what is it like to be compassionate.
And I think that allows us to take well-intentioned and better informed action. That's the piece that I like about it. Katie, this has been terrific. If listeners are curious and wanted to find out more, where would you recommend that they head?
I'd recommend first and foremost to go to my website, McLaughlinMethod.com. And if you are wanting to dig into this whole engagement survey thing, but it feels a little overwhelming, I know. And so I've created a guide that helps you understand how to break down some of these questions, even how to get a hold of the survey results if you've never seen them before, and really helps you to start thinking about taking action for yourself. And that's right on my website. The guide is called Show Your Team, You Hear Them.
And we'll include links to that in the show notes. Katie, thank you so much for doing this. Appreciate you taking the time out.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.